At 5:58 in the morning, Flores Island was quiet. Most people were still asleep. Some were just beginning to stir. At a seminary in Secca, students and nuns had gathered for morning mass. At the port of Momer, workers were beginning their day. Along the northern coastline, fishermen were preparing their boats for the water. And then, without warning, the earth broke open. Not a slow rumble, not a gradual build. An instant, violent, catastrophic rupture beneath the seafloor, 68 kilometers off the northern coast of Flores Island, Indonesia. Magnitude 7.7. One of the most powerful earthquakes to strike this region in over 3 decades. Roofs collapsed. Walls split apart. People were thrown from their beds onto floors that would not stop moving. And within minutes, before the dust had settled, before anyone had time to think, sirens were screaming across 4 provinces, and a single message was reaching every coastal community for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Get away from the water. Right now, do not wait. This is what happened on August 15th, 2026. This is the Flores earthquake. And this is a story that every person watching needs to understand completely, because what happened this morning is not just a breaking news event. It is the intersection of science, memory, preparation, and survival, playing out in real time on one of the most geologically dangerous stretches of land on the planet. Stay with me. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are genuinely shocking. The United States Geological Survey, the USGS, the agency that monitors seismic activity across the entire globe, registered this earthquake at magnitude 7.7. That is not a number that gets used casually. To understand what 7.7 actually means, you have to understand how the magnitude scale works. It is logarithmic. That means each step up the scale does not represent a linear increase in energy. It represents an exponential one. A magnitude 7.7 earthquake releases roughly 5 times the energy of a 7.0. It releases approximately 30 times the energy of a 6.7. We're not talking about a stronger version of a moderate earthquake. We are talking about an entirely different category of geological violence. The kind of earthquake that liquefies the ground beneath ports, that drops bridges into rivers, that takes buildings which have stood for 50 years and reduces them to rubble in under 60 seconds. Now add this. The depth of this earthquake was recorded at just 10 kilometers below the seafloor. That detail is critical. In earthquake science, depth determines how much of the energy reaches the surface before it begins to dissipate. Shallow earthquakes, classified as anything under 70 kilometers, are the most dangerous category precisely because the energy has less distance to travel. Less distance means less dissipation. Less dissipation means the shaking at the surface is more intense, more sudden, and more destructive. This was not a deep tremor that rolled gradually through the earth. This was a shallow, violent rupture, close to the surface, hitting the ground like a hammer swung from 6 inches away instead of 6 feet. The epicenter was located approximately 68 kilometers north-northwest of the city of Ende in East Nusa Tenggara province. The earthquake struck in the Flores Sea, directly off the northern coast of the island, in a location that seismologists have been watching with significant concern for a very long time. The reason they watch it has a name, the Flores Back-Arc Thrust. This is a fault system that runs along the northern coast of the Lesser Sunda Islands. It was formed by one of the most relentless geological processes on Earth. The Indo-Australian plate, grinding northward and downward beneath the Eurasian plate at a convergence rate of 80 millimeters per year. That sounds like almost nothing. Over human timescales, it is almost nothing, but over geological time, that 80 millimeters per year builds stress in the Earth's crust the way slowly twisting a metal rod builds stress in the metal. Eventually, something gives, and when it gives all at once. The Flores Back-Arc Thrust is one of the most geologically stressed fault systems on the planet, and it has a history that makes this morning's earthquake not just terrifying in the present tense, but deeply, uncomfortably familiar. In December of 1992, the eastern segment of this same fault system ruptured. The earthquake registered at magnitude 7.7, the same magnitude as this morning's event. It struck the same island, the same coastline, the same fault. It killed more than 2,500 people. Roughly half of those deaths were not caused by the shaking itself. They were caused by what came next. Tsunami waves that crested at 26 meters in some locations along the coast. That is over 85 feet. Nearly 9 stories of water, moving at the speed of a commercial jet at lower altitudes, hitting communities where people had nowhere to run and no warning that it was coming. Entire villages were erased. Coastal settlements on small offshore islands were completely swept away. The seafront of Momer, one of the largest cities on the island, was destroyed. This morning, the world woke up to a geological scenario that was, in the most precise scientific sense, a repeat of 1992. Same fault. Same island, same magnitude. The people of Flores Island knew what that meant. The first accounts to emerge came through emergency broadcasts, local media, and eyewitness reports streaming in real time from across the affected area. What they described was not the paralysis of shock, it was motion. Urgent, immediate, organized motion. People running, sirens activating, entire neighborhoods moving toward higher ground in the darkness of the pre-dawn hours, driven by instincts shaped not just by official guidance, but by 3 decades of community memory. Indonesia's National Disaster Management Agency, known as BNPB, was the first official body to confirm deaths. 2 people, a man and a woman, killed at the Elsa Maumere port, one of the largest and most critical infrastructure points on Flores Island, serving a city of nearly 88,000 residents. At least one additional person was reported injured at the port, where earthquake damage was described as severe by local officials. The port matters for reasons beyond the immediate tragedy. Maumere is connected to the rest of the Indonesian archipelago primarily by sea. Its port is an economic artery for the island, handling cargo, ferry services, fishing operations, and supply chains that reach into remote coastal communities across the region. When port infrastructure sustains serious structural damage in a major earthquake, the effects radiate outward. Food supply, medical access, the movement of rescue teams and emergency equipment. Repairing that infrastructure is not a logistical footnote. It is frontline emergency work. Local media footage circulating online showed extensive damage across the Maumere area, structural damage along the waterfront, damage through the downtown core, buildings that had survived decades of minor tremors, revealing their vulnerabilities under 7.7 magnitude, shaking from 10 kilometers below the seafloor. In Ruteng, in the Manggarai region, further west on the island, AFP photographers captured images of damaged houses, walls cracked apart, ceilings pulled down, debris filling rooms that hours earlier had been family homes. And then there was the account from the seminary. Students at St. Peter Major Seminary in Seka, known locally as Rita Perret Seminary, were gathered for morning mass when the earthquake struck. The rector, Reverend Gudelis Tanga, described the scene in terms that communicate the violence of the event more vividly than any seismograph reading. Students and nuns ran from the assembly hall as the roof began collapsing above them mid-service. At least one priest suffered a broken leg, not from falling debris, not from a collapsing wall, from jumping from the second floor of a building to escape, making a split-second decision in the chaos of a structure coming apart around him. A priest, in morning mass, jumping from a second-story window. That is what a shallow magnitude 7.7 earthquake does to a building. That is what 10 kilometers of depth means when translated into human experience. The USGS published shaking intensity estimates that frame the scale of impact across the broader population. Approximately 56,000 people experienced what seismologists classify as severe shaking. Around 420,000 people felt very strong shaking. More than 1 million people felt strong shaking. And several million more across a far wider geographic area felt moderate to strong ground motion. In Makassar, the major regional city in South Sulawesi, approximately 400 kilometers northwest of the epicenter, residents reported strong shaking that lasted for 2 full minutes. 2 minutes of continuous ground motion. If you have never experienced a significant earthquake, it is genuinely difficult to convey how long 2 minutes actually feels when the earth beneath you will not stop moving. When every structure around you is groaning and shifting. When you cannot stand without falling. When your brain cannot determine whether what is happening is going to stop or is going to get worse. 2 minutes is not a brief event. It is an eternity of uncertainty. Indonesia's National Meteorology, Climatology, and Geophysics Agency, BMKG, moved with the speed that the situation demanded. Within minutes of the main earthquake, they issued a tsunami warning covering coastlines across 4 provinces simultaneously: East Nusa Tenggara, West Nusa Tenggara, South Sulawesi, Southeast Sulawesi. 22 areas in total were placed under alert status. BMKG calculated estimated tsunami arrival times ranging from approximately 4 minutes after the earthquake for the nearest coastlines to roughly 1 hour and 40 minutes for more distant areas. That window of uncertainty across a span of nearly 2 hours is exactly why the warning system exists. You cannot tell coastal communities that waves might arrive in 4 minutes and expect them to wait for more precise information. You issue the warning, you tell people to move immediately. BNPB official Abdul Muari delivered that message directly to the public through the national broadcaster Compass TV. His instructions were not complicated. They did not require interpretation. Move more than 2 kilometers inland, or climb to ground at least 10 meters above sea level. Do not wait for confirmation. Do not return to collect belongings. Move away from the shore. Carry out self-evacuation immediately. The language of disaster officials is almost always measured and carefully calibrated to avoid panic while communicating urgency. When officials use the word immediately, it carries weight. The people of Flores Island, shaped by 1992, understood that weight. They moved. Tsunami waves were recorded. BMKG confirmed that waves reached several affected coastlines. The measured height of those waves at the recording points was under 1 meter. That number deserves to be stated clearly and then examined carefully. Under 1 meter. That is what arrived on shore after the history of this region. After 1992 and the 26-meter walls of water that erased coastal villages. After 2018, when a tsunami in Palu Bay killed thousands in circumstances that scientists are still studying. After all of that, the waves that reached shore this morning measured under 1 meter. The tsunami warning was eventually lifted. Australia's Tsunami Warning Centre confirmed no threat to the Australian mainland or territories. The Pacific-wide catastrophe scenario that a 7.7 magnitude shallow earthquake in a known tsunami generating zone could produce did not materialize. And here is what matters most about that outcome. It does not mean the danger was not real. It does not mean the warning was an overreaction. It does not mean the people who ran were wrong to run. It does not mean the system failed or overcorrected. The difference between a small tsunami and a catastrophic one comes down to factors that cannot be calculated in real time. The specific geometry of the fault rupture, the angle and direction of seafloor displacement, the bathymetry of the ocean floor between the epicenter and the shore, the resonance characteristics of particular bays and inlets. These are variables that seismologists can analyze and understand only after the fact, with full data from instruments that take time to transmit and process. In real time, on the morning of August 15, 2026, the known information was this. A magnitude 7.7 earthquake at 10 kilometers depth had just ruptured on a known tsunami-generating fault, the same fault that produced a 26-meter tsunami in 1992. The correct response was to treat that as a tsunami threat and warn every coastal community within reach. That response was correct. That response was executed. And the people of Flores Island, shaped by institutional memory and 3 decades of living with what 1992 did to this coastline, responded to the warning the way it needed to be responded to. The situation did not produce a catastrophic tsunami this morning, but the response to the warning almost certainly prevented additional casualties from whatever did arrive on shore, and it established the pattern of behavior that will save lives in a future event where the waves are not under 1 meter. By 22:28 UTC, less than 30 minutes after the main earthquake, seismologists had already recorded 3 significant aftershocks. The first measured magnitude 5.9. The second registered at 5.6. The third reached magnitude 6.1. Let that number settle for a moment. A 6.1 magnitude aftershock is not a tremor. It is not background noise. In most countries, in most contexts, a 6.1 earthquake would be the lead story of the day. It is large enough to collapse structures that the main shock has already weakened, large enough to trigger new landslides in terrain that the initial earthquake has destabilized, large enough to reactivate tsunami alert systems across the same coastlines that have just begun to stand down. And when a 7.7 main shock is followed by a 6.1 aftershock within 30 minutes, the geological event is not over. The danger is ongoing. In earthquake science, aftershock sequences follow predictable statistical patterns in terms of frequency, described by what scientists call Omori's law, which tells us that aftershocks are most frequent immediately following the main event and taper off over time. But that law describes frequency. It says nothing about the magnitude of individual aftershocks, which cannot be predicted with precision. The next aftershock could be a 4.2, it could be a 5.8. In rare cases, it could be larger than what came before. For the people of Flores Island, that uncertainty is not abstract. It is the lived reality of the days and weeks ahead. Every tremor becomes a question. Is this the one? Every creak in a damaged building becomes a potential signal. People who cannot return to homes deemed structurally unsafe will sleep in cars, in fields, in emergency shelters, waiting for shaking that may or may not come, unable to fully exhale until enough time has passed and enough seismic quiet has accumulated to suggest the worst is behind them. That psychological weight is real. It is documented, and it is one of the dimensions of a major earthquake event that does not appear in the damage assessment reports, but shapes the human experience of recovery in profound ways. The USGS issued a yellow alert for shaking-related fatalities and economic losses. Under their classification framework, a yellow alert indicates that some casualties and damage are possible, and that the impact is expected to be relatively localized, requiring a local or regional level response rather than a massive international humanitarian operation. This alert level shapes how governments, NGOs, and international bodies mobilize resources. It determines the scale of the response being prepared. That assessment is based in part on the building stock of the affected region, and that assessment carries its own layer of concern. The USGS noted that the population of this area resides predominantly in structures that are vulnerable to earthquake shaking, specifically unreinforced brick with concrete floors and precast concrete frames with wall construction. These are building types that perform poorly under significant seismic loading because they lack the flexibility to absorb and distribute the energy of ground motion. They do not bend, they break. And when they break, they collapse suddenly, with little warning, with devastating consequences for anyone inside. The USGS also flagged that recent earthquakes in this region have triggered secondary hazards, including tsunamis and landslides. The mountainous terrain of Flores Island is particularly susceptible to slope instability following a major seismic event. Hillsides weakened by the shaking, potentially combined with rainfall in the days ahead, could trigger debris flows and landslides in areas that are already dealing with the direct damage of the earthquake itself. Remote villages on steep terrain, which are among the hardest to reach for assessment teams, may face this compounding risk in the coming days. To understand why this island, this fault, this stretch of ocean keeps appearing in the history of major earthquakes, you have to understand the broader geology of the nation that Flores Island is part of, Indonesia, a country of more than 270 million people, an archipelago of roughly 17,000 islands stretching across more than 5,000 kilometers of ocean, and one of the most geologically extreme locations on Earth. Indonesia sits at the collision point of three major tectonic plates: the Eurasian Plate, the Pacific Plate, the Indo-Australian Plate. The entire country sits within the Pacific Ring of Fire, the horseshoe-shaped zone of intense seismic and volcanic activity encircling the Pacific Ocean, responsible for approximately 90% of the world's earthquakes.